The Devil May Cry games are all about the boys. There's a ton of them. All of them tough guys with quirky one-liners and big swords and a tough strut. They're cool, they're strong, they're manly. But what exactly makes them so masculine? Where do these traditions come from, and who inspires the masculinity of these men? And what is this series trying to say about what it means to be a man or a demon? When you connect Devil May Cry to the greater literary trends of Japan in the last century, you find quite a few connections that show the characters of DMC are part of a larger conversation about what it means to be a man in Japan. Virgil is an old-fashioned figure. He has his pride, he has his honor, he values power, and only works with those who also value power more than anything else. He is willing to sacrifice lives, to work with monsters, to ignore conventional morality, so long as his goals are met. His sword and his style in combat both draw upon more traditional Japanese warrior styles, the samurai. His clothing alludes to it. This concept art from DMC5 says goth kimono, which may imply that was the inspiration behind his jacket. He dresses well, speaks in a cultured fashion, and gives off the air that he is of a higher class of people. His sword is a katana, and his movements mimic the sword styles used by samurai for centuries. The specific style Virgil uses in DMC5 is called iajutsu or iado, a style in which the user is meant to draw the blade and cut their opponent in the same move. Tradition says the name came from the Japanese phrase sune ni ite, kiu ni awasu, being constantly prepared, match the opposition immediately. It is a style that focuses upon preparation, the ability to react to and retaliate to any eventuality. There's a heavy focus on mental pressure, the concept of saya no uchi dikatsu, meaning victory in the scabbard of the sword. The practitioner develops a mental fortitude and imposing presence that dissuades the opposition from opposing them, a style that allows for victory before the sword has even left the scabbard. It is practiced with calm serenity punctuated by decisive acts, where the focus is to be centered, to maintain mental focus and promote peaceful relations. You can see the similarities between the style and Virgil's moves by comparing these two videos. Virgil begins in seiza, the traditional sitting position of a practitioner. His movements are similar to the various sword styles of this school, and he performs the stylized return of the blade to the scabbard, called noto. The Yamato, Virgil's blade, has a name which is a multifaceted reference to Japanese cultural history. The way the word is spelled refers to the Buddhist and Shinto deity of the underworld, Yama. Yamato is the name of an ancient group of people who established the early Japanese court and the imperial lineage, whose descendants are recognized as a large ethnic group of the Japanese islands. One of their most prominent historical figures is the warrior poet Yamato Takeru, a prince whose life is depicted in the oldest Japanese texts. He was a great warrior, sent by the emperor on various conquests that involved invading the lands of their neighbors and murdering their leaders. After killing his own brother, he was sent to wage war by his father in the hopes he would die in battle. He was eventually killed, but not in war. He blasphemed against a god, and in return was struck down by disease. The term Yamato in the modern sense is most commonly known as part of the phrase Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit. It's historically associated with the rise of nationalism which led to World War II and one of the darkest periods of Japanese history. The term became a rallying cry for the military in the 1930s, a time when the Japanese government was heightening its propaganda and attempting to spread its empire into nearby territories. The fallout would be devastating. Japan suffered constant bombing by the Allies even before 2 atomic bombs reduced millions of lives to ash. Including soldiers lost on the front lines, entire families vanished in the chaos of war. People simply disappeared. In the aftermath, the occupation led to Japan being controlled by Americans, and the Japanese people feeling as if their own nation, their government, and their faith had betrayed them. They'd lost everything, and for what? It was a devastating blow, one that was felt for decades and was explored in what became known as post-war fiction. Yamato is a term that calls on old ideas of Japanese life, the pride of the warrior, the isolationist mindset, the belief that might makes right, that power and glory is all that matters, that in failure it is better to die rather than be shamed. There is a lot in Virgil's characterization that is drawn not only from the samurai of old, but from modern nationalism, which itself drew a great deal from samurai culture. These ideas led to great tragedy for the nation, and Virgil too finds himself in horrific scenarios because of his warrior pride. He too loses his identity, his sense of self, made into a tool of someone else before he nearly destroys himself out of a sense of shame and self-loathing. When Virgil takes Yamato back from Nero, he does not immediately use the sword, though he says he's running out of time. He still makes the effort to return to his childhood home. It is a ceremonial thing. He is performing a kind of suicide, and there is no missing the visual motif that ties this scene to seppuku, the ritual suicide of the samurai. It would not have been done with a sword, but stabbing the gut in such a gruesome way, watching Virgil fall to his knees inside his own home, it certainly pulls on those themes. This does not bring his suffering to an end. It creates 2 half-beings, both of which are incomplete. Urizen is missing most of V's memories, and seems to have none of the spirit and drive that V does. Without someone to interact with, the demon merely sits and waits. It takes no actions of its own. V, meanwhile, has the memories and personality with none of the inner strength. He is slowly fading and must rely upon his familiars to survive. Only together, reunited, is he able to return to his stronger form as Virgil, with a new understanding of his own strengths and weaknesses. Still, Virgil cannot let go of the past so easily. He is the past, the ghost of another era, in which the way of the sword ruled and strict lines of class and societal structure defined the world. He clings to these old values which led to his own imprisonment in hell and the near destruction of his soul. Yet he knows no other way to live, since the moment his childhood ended and he was forced to survive alone, relying upon the sword. That has been the only way of life open to him. Dante is his brother's opposite in nearly every way. Where Virgil is collected and controlled, Dante is chaotic and irreverent. Where Virgil dresses meticulously, Dante barely manages to wear clothes, and his outfit gets ripped in DMC5. He runs around wearing a jacket with a single sleeve. Where Virgil seeks out power, Dante seems to seek nothing. He has no real direction, no real interest in anything. He loves pizza and women, sensations and distractions, ignoring the real world and the nightmares within it. His sword is a giant Western-style blade named Rebellion, and that is the key to what Dante really is. His character is rebellious, but he's a rebel without a cause, and he embodies a character type born from a specific era in Japanese history, one tied heavily to the post-war era, and the generation of writers who grew up in the shadow of World War II, the first of which is the horror and sci-fi novelist Hideyuki Kikuchi. His works are part of an era known as the occult boom and later the horror boom, a time in which the Japanese became obsessed with the idea of the end of the world, an imminent apocalypse. The stories inevitably dealt with world-ending scenarios, heavily influenced by the suffering and death Japan saw during the 1940s and the nightmare of the atomic bombings. His first book, published in the early 1980s, was called Demon City Shinjuku, in which an apocalyptic earthquake powered by dark magic turned the entirety of Shinjuku into a demon-filled wasteland, killing thousands and establishing a city of monsters and magic. This is the setting into which our hero Kyoya enters. See, he's not really interested in fighting the good fight. He's a troublemaker, a slacker, and a flirt. Though he inherited a powerful sword from his deceased father, who was himself a legendary warrior, and whose spiritual energy powers the weapon Kyoya wields, the son wants nothing to do with his father's battles. The demon quake and the dangers presented in the novel all come from Kyoya's father's mortal enemy, but Kyoya's not all that upset about it. His remark to meeting the man is to comment that he is more attractive than his father. He's all sass, constantly making fun of every enemy he meets before putting them down with great skill. His rough exterior and jovial manner hide a more serious side. He does care about people, and he has a good heart, which is what eventually helps him stop the bad guy and save the girl. Kyoya matches Dante's background very well. They have very similar personalities, especially in Devil May Cry 3, where Dante comes off as irreverent, delinquent, flirtatious, lacking direction or meaning until he's shown what he should care about by the intervention of a good woman. He's got a legendary dead father with a magic inherited sword, a sassy attitude, and incredible talent. The delinquent hero has become common in anime and manga. Yusuke from Yu Yu Hakusho has a lot of the same features, including an ancient bloodline to a superpowered father figure, and I'm sure other examples could be found. Demon City Shinjuku feels like the earliest prototype of the character, that the West has access to at least. All the literary history I've read about Japan doesn't cover weird horror from the 80s. Variations on the character appear in other places too. The most noticeable is the work of Go Nagai, one of Japan's most prominent and important manga artists. He's most famous for his series Devilman in the West. But before it, he wrote a story called Demon Lord Dante, which is about a demon who possesses a human and becomes a hybrid of both worlds. Devilman was a toned-down variation of Dante, which started serialization in 1972. It too centered on a human who becomes half-devil, torn between two worlds while trying to save humankind. Akira starts as a bit of a weakling, but once he has demonic power, he becomes far more cocky, violent, and smart-mouthed. But what's interesting is how the story reveals that Akira is ultimately still a human at heart. He continues to be emotional and driven by his feelings, and he is constantly shown to be crying at major moments of the story. Devilman is a tale that ends in the ultimate tragedy. War and hate overwhelm the world until humanity destroys itself. The Rebel Without a Cause is the outcome of a generation of people growing up in a world cast adrift after World War II. Everything that established Japan and the Japanese way of life was in question. Suffering and poverty were widespread, and a sense of dread, of apocalyptic nightmares on the horizon was very real. The sense of loss and the loss of identity was enormous, and the creation of a hero who cares about nothing, who rebels against authority, represents this sense of loss. The hero who is heroic in how he rejects the world, because the world no longer seems to have any meaning. Yet these heroes ultimately do try to help the world. They find something they care about enough to fight for, though many of them, like Devilman, still fail to make a real difference. Dante is hardly the first or the last of the half-blood characters to struggle between worlds, and the delinquent hero is still very common. While the heavy trauma and tragedy of the stories in the 70s and 80s have been toned down in recent decades, many of the themes are still present in modern fiction in Japan. Those threads find themselves intertwining in Dante, a half-demon and a delinquent hero, trying not to care about the world that has abandoned him. He puts up a tough guy act. But as was recently going around on Twitter, he is genuinely afraid for his life, something that isn't immediately obvious in gameplay, but becomes tragically clear when you consider his backstory. Dante's tough guy act is a cover for the pain he hides, which becomes clear when he's shown mourning and crying in the games, much like the heroes of the 80s and 90s. Not only Devilman, but Fist of the North Star, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and other stories that popularized masculine heroes who expressed sorrow through tears. Like them, Dante is not demasculinized by his tears. It's part of his masculinity. It shows how he's struggling to keep himself together, but the pain is so great that this has finally pushed him over. It says something about the events till this point, how much he's been through, and how painful this particular moment is that it drives him to cry. It also says something about the greater arc of Dante's character in the timeline. In the games, Dante cries in 1 and 3. In the later titles, it is Nero who takes on that role. This is a subtle way of portraying the transformation Dante goes through, from taking on the young, delinquent hero role, who secretly still has some hope left to lose, to passing on his role to the next generation, because part of Dante has lost his way. He's gone from being the man who reached out to save his brother, to the man who no longer tries reaching out. It will take Nero to do that for him. Nero is a fantastic blend of Dante and Virgil. He has some of the ice of his father's personality, his seriousness and reserve, yet there's plenty of Dante's fire too. Some of that is clearly a conscious choice of his to emulate Dante. Between the 4th and 5th games, Nero becomes far more confident and spunky. He teases his opponents and takes his fights far less seriously. In quiet moments, however, he's sincere and serious, gentle with his human companions, and has a more mature attitude compared to Dante at the same age. He's not exactly the same character type as his uncle or his father, but he has the same spark of the delinquent hero, the emotional heart that has him continue to fight and struggle through trials and tribulations without losing hope, something that Dante at this point has lost, and which Virgil has never had. The major difference between the three comes from their childhoods and the source of their masculinity. Both Dante and Virgil develop masculine personas in response to trauma. They are orphaned and hunted by demons from a young age, and forced to care for themselves, to survive in violent, horrifying scenarios. Virgil develops an icy facade and a samurai warrior's pride in response to his isolation and the feeling that his mother had abandoned him. Dante, having watched his mother die for him, becomes a rebellious delinquent who doesn't care about anything, so that he can no longer lose anything. While DMC5 shows the brothers reuniting and makes it clear by the end there's still a bond between them, the harsh reality of the personas they wear, the armor they've made, is too hard to escape. Virgil cannot let go of his pride. Dante takes too long to get past his own hang-ups, and by then, Virgil is out of reach. In DMC5, we see them reunited again and on the same road to damnation. Virgil's two halves are reunited. He more clearly understands his own trauma and what he wants from the world. But he's not immediately capable of telling his brother that. He's still wearing the armor of the warrior, acting as if the only way he can communicate is with his sword. Dante, too, is wearing his armor. He acts as if this is just another day at work, as if it doesn't matter, pretending he doesn't care. It's all to protect Nero, the young man whose father Dante believes has to be killed. Rather than forcing Nero to suffer the trauma he has, Dante takes it upon himself and pretends that this isn't yet another scar on his heart by playing the rebel. His shell breaks in the scene in which he finally tells Nero the truth about his bloodline, but then he returns to being his irreverent self, leaving to face his brother. Nero never had to turn his personality into a shield to defend himself. He has suffered, certainly, but nothing like the twins have. He had a normal family, a pretty normal childhood, for all that he grew up in a cult and started dating his sister. His troubles began as an older teen, and he had support from friends and family along the way. At that age, both Virgil and Dante were alone. For that reason, Nero is far more emotionally healthy and stable, and the best representation of what a man is in this family. Just like his uncle and his father, he's more than capable of standing up to and fighting his family when he has to. But he can also lose with grace. He can be honest about his feelings, his wants and needs. In DMC4, he eventually works with Dante instead of against him, even though he has very little reason to trust him. In DMC5, once Nero learns the truth about Dante and Virgil, not only does he refuse to kill them, he refuses to let them kill each other. Dante and Virgil just aren't capable of taking that step by themselves. They've seen too much shit, suffered too much all these years. It takes Nero waking them up, pointing out the obvious. Their family. Maybe it's time to try and settle their differences more normally. What brought them here was a lot of mistakes, a series of consequences stemming from that singular tragedy in their childhoods, with both boys doing their best to survive an impossible situation. Now, finally, they've escaped that time. They have survived. They don't have to keep wearing the armor. It takes Nero to show them they can let their shields down for a while. And lo and behold, in the extra scenes during the end of the game, we see exactly that has happened. Virgil and Dante are still very much themselves, but they are softer, just a little gentler with each other. No one's being stabbed, a first for the boys, and they're teasing each other, fighting back to back and defending one another. This is the path they've been struggling to reach for so long, and they've finally made it to the real masculine ideal, that of unity, of brotherhood, of men who can fight but can also feel, in a world in which even the devil may cry.